Okay, hi. How are you?
Have a seat.
Okay, Mr. Bennett from Deutsche Bank. Here we have. So how many people have you talked to about this trade?
A few. There's definitely some interest.
Let's see what you got.
I'm sorry.
You smell that? What is that?
What?
What's that smell?
A cologne?
No.
Opportunity.
No. Money.
Oh, okay.
I smell money.
Okay.
Chris. God damn it.
Sorry.
This is your basic mortgage bond. All right? The originals were simple. They were just thousands of AAA mortgages bundled together, guaranteed by the U.S. government. The modern ones are different. They're private, and they're made up of layers of tranches. The highest level AAAs getting paid first, the lowest rated Bs getting paid last, taking on defaults first. Now, obviously, if you're buying Bs, you can make more money, but they're a little risky. Sometimes they fail. Chris? Somewhere along the line, these Bs and double Bs went from a little risky to dog shit. Where's the trash?
Behind you.
I'm talking rock bottom FICO scores. No income verification. Adjustable rates, dog shit. The default rates are already up from 1% to 4%, fellas. And if they rise to 8%, and they will, a lot of these triple Bs are going to 0 too. And that, you're too close, is an opportunity.
Okay, you're saying that at 8% the bonds fail and we are already at 4%?
That's right.
If they go to 8, it's Armageddon.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're offering us a chance to short this pile of blocks? How?
With something called a credit default swap. It's like insurance on the bond, and if it goes bust, you can make 10 to 1, even 20 to 1 return, and it's already slowly going bust.
10 to 1, 20 to 1. No way.
And no one's paying attention. No one is paying attention because the banks are too busy getting paid obscene fees to sell these bonds.
But wait, you are the bank. When you work for the bank, I bet your margins are pretty nice and fat.
Let's not talk about my margins, by the way. Being nice and fat, that's a nice shirt. Do they make it for men?
Aren't you the bank?
I work for the bank. I don't think like a bank. Big bank, small bank, I like to make money. All right? Let me put it this way. I'm standing in front of a burning house, and I'm offering you fire insurance on it.
How can these underlying bonds be as bad as you say? It wouldn't be legal.
Nobody knows what's in them. Nobody knows what's in the bonds. I've seen some that are 65% AAA rated, that I know for a fact are filled with 95% subprime shit with FICOs below 550.
Get the out of here.
You want me to really blow your mind? When the market deems a bond too risky to buy, what do you think we do with it? Take a guess.
I don't know, you tell me.
All right. You think we just warehouse it on the books? No. We just repackage it with a bunch of other shit and sell and put it into a CDO.
A CDO.
Yes, a CDO.
What is that?
This is where we take a bunch of Bs, double Bs, and triple Bs that haven't sold, and we put them in a pile. And when the pile gets large enough, the whole thing is suddenly considered diversified. And then the whores at the rating agency give it a 92, 93% AAA rating. No questions asked.
Say that again.
A collateralized debt obligation. It's important to understand because it's what allowed a housing crisis to become a nationwide economic disaster. Here's world-famous chef Anthony Bourdain to explain.
Okay, I'm a chef on a Sunday afternoon, setting the menu at a big restaurant. I ordered my fish on Friday, which is the mortgage bond that Michael Burry shorted. But some of the fresh fish doesn't sell. I don't know why. Maybe it just came out halibut has the intelligence of a dolphin. So what am I going to do? Throw all this unsold fish, which is the triple B level of the bond, in the garbage and take the loss? No way. Being the crafty and morally onerous chef that I am, whatever crappy levels of the bond I don't sell, I throw into a seafood stew. See, it's not old fish. It's a whole new thing. And the best part is they're eating 3-day-old halibut. That is a CDO.
Well, I just need to know how these could possibly be collated.
So somehow you're
I
like
find it very
Dora
difficult
the
to believe that it
Explorer,
could
and
even
you're
be-
the first person who has found this thing.
Hold on. So mortgage bonds are dog. CDOs are dog wrapped in cat shit.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Institutions treat these CDOs like they're as solid as treasury bonds, and they're going to zero.
No, it can't be right. There were $500 billion in housing bonds. So last year alone, the ratings agencies, the banks, the government, you're saying they're all asleep at the wheel?
Yeah. My whole department's long on this stuff. They call me Chicken Little. They call me Bubble Boy. A's, 0. B's, 0. Double B's, 0. Triple B's, 0. And then that happens.
What is that?
That's America's housing market.
Hand me down the walking cane, hand me down my hat. Hurry now and don't be late, 'cause we ain't got time to chat. You and me, we're going out.
So we are coming from another week of class for another week. We're close to being done. I'm really I think we only have two after this one, 2 regular weeks of class, and then you have your finals. So I mean, this is really coming up quick. So we are going to be talking about econ today, and luckily there is no math for both you and I. If you guys are wondering if this entails you learning any math, no, it does not. This is only about how government interacts with economics and how government can control economics, what it can and cannot control, because there's many things that we blame our government for and certain things that they just don't have any control over. But there are some things that they can do to try to make things better or more accessible for the American people. So for today, I'm going to talk about a couple different things to the history around economic development, how government has grown into expanding certain parts of its government influence over our economic system, things that it can and cannot control. We're going to talk about some stuff that we've probably gone over in some contexts, especially like the New Deal, the Great Depression. There have been many, many things that we've gone through in other weeks that have kind of related to all this, but economics is so different because it just brings all these different aspects of economic development, trade. This is really important right now because we're going through a time where our ideas of economics are kind of changing. We have a president currently, as of this recording, who does not technically believe in a free market. In fact, the funny thing is he says things quite often that are very anti-free market, and that's gone against the trends of our presidents over the course of time. So we're going to look at the history of economic development, modern economic policy. So we're talking about economic stability, deregulation, taxation, deficit spending, fiscal policy, monetary policy. So just for overall economic policy, this is the only 3 things that the government really has any control over when it comes to economic policy, and the things that they are responsible for. They are first responsible for expansion. They are responsible for expanding economic development. We're going to go over exactly what that means and what context that expansion means. The second one is regulation. So regulating the economy, how are they going to regulate different industries? We're going to go into more detail on how exactly the regulation of the United States government has expanded since the time of Taft and Roosevelt and all those who really came from a time where there was almost no government regulation to now government being heavily involved in certain things, but then we kind of have this balancing act where we go back and forth between what should be regulated and what should not be regulated. The third one is stabilization, so stabilizing the economy. If the economy starts to dip, how do we build it back up? If we go through a time of recession, if we go through a time where there are things that aren't as great as they could be, what does that mean for us? How do those things get solved, especially when it comes to creating jobs, to stabilizing the overall marketplace? We have a free market, but there are things that our government can do to try to combat certain really horrible times like any depressions or recessions or anything like that. So the first one that we're going to talk about is expansion. And this is basically what the government's been in charge of since the founding of the country. U.S. economy is a mix of free enterprise characterized by 3 different things. Private ownership of property, so you privately owning your own land, you're owning a business. all those things are private enterprise. The second one is marketplace competition. So when you have two businesses that are competing against one another, people in the free market are going to choose certain businesses or types of businesses that they prefer over others. And this is a competition between multiple different actors or multiple different entities. And the third one is private enterprise. This is not controlled by government. It is privately owned enterprises. Unlike some countries where many businesses are controlled by the government, there is no government-controlled businesses necessarily. The government can do things that can help private business. They can have certain entities that help private business, but there is no government-owned enterprise. It is all private. And this falls around the ideas from Adam Smith, which is all about capitalism. We live in a capitalist society. These are the things that make a capitalist society. We are probably one of the foremost capitalist societies in the world. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, we can talk about. To start with our economic history, from the beginning portion of our country, usually our state governments were seen as the best way to handle their economy. And that was because so many different states were better able to deal with the individual things that each state could do really well. Again, they looked at themselves as their own country, so they really had their own marketplaces too. And they had their own money even before we even made our country officially. All these different states had different forms of money, had different currency, and this all made things really difficult. So states were seen as the best way to handle this. States were better able to inspect, license, and regulate any type of business. So those are the three most important things sometimes when you're talking about regulation is inspecting. How can they inspect the industry and know what their state needs? Licensing people and licensing businesses, being able to portion out land for people, and states were really able to handle that. And then also to regulate how the economy was going to flow and what things they might need or might need to take a look at. Usually the federal government kept out of all except for interstate regulation and tariffs. It was known as the jungle. It really was this wild west of no regulation and anybody could do what they felt like. And the Industrial Revolution changed the role of government in the economy. I mean, it was the Industrial Revolution that brought all of the forefront of all these great economic achievements. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it modernized our economy. As the economy grew, so did social issues. So such as there was a huge population boom. So when you have large amounts of people in a city, you're going to create a lot of disproportional amounts of wealth. The wealth can't spread everywhere. And when people are getting richer and some people are getting poorer, that creates some issues. Industrial accidents, not having safe machinery, not having people who were working in safe conditions. All these sorts of things would happen that would basically kill workers, would kill innocent people. It wasn't exactly the best time for the regulation of this kind of stuff since it was so new. The machinery was just invented, and this is the first moment where people had to really start to think about how we're going to regulate and make these things safe. There were also labor and management disputes. There was child labor for many, many years in Europe, and then it came to the United States. A lot of horrible hours, low pay, but people relied on it for their job. I mean, where else were they going to find something unless they were able to work their way up? And people talked more and more about it, and this is where workers' rights and labor unions began to pop up around our country. And the last one is unemployment. Not enough jobs to go around. If more people are in a city and they're all looking for the same job, unless you have a boom where more and more workers are needed, you're constantly going to have unemployment and unemployment issues. And with that comes its own issues in terms of poverty, feeding people, making the economy grow more. And unemployment is a huge factor when we look at our economic development. For most of the government's early history within our economic system, the government's role was to service-oriented. So meaning that they were really there to just expand and be there for businesses. They were not there to regulate them or slow them down, quote unquote. But this changed at the regulatory bureaucracy after the stock market crash of 1929, which began the Great Depression. Once that changed, it changed everything about how we regulate our system. The stock market crash was a major meltdown, and it was because there was no regulation on many different businesses. And when the market just bubbled, just grew, and it popped, and our whole economy tanked. There are a lot of different reasons why the Great Depression happened, but that stock market crash was really the first sign of just big businesses growing too much and growing too fast and doing things that really, it grew so far, and there was no regulation that businesses were able to take advantage of it, and the stock market just ended up crashing. A lot of it was due to the fact that businesses would fail, banks would fail regularly before the 1929 crash. There was almost no regulation of banks whatsoever. People would put money in a bank, and then the bank wouldn't follow up with people. All of a sudden, the bank would be gone, and people's money would be gone too. It was really scary. I mean, there was no insurance on that money. And now when you put your money in a bank, you are going to be insured. So you're not going to lose your money if that bank fails. You're going to get your money back. So this is why banks needed to be regulated, but they weren't. They failed on a constant basis, and that was one of the many causes, but this was one of the big causes for the crash in 1929, which led to the Great Depression. And there is a cyclical nature of our economy. We're always going to go through times of great expansion, and then all of a sudden that's going to dip, and then we're going to go into times of depression. And by depression, I do not mean like a full depression like we had before, but it could be a recession, it could be a depression. Our highs and our lows all depend on just how good or bad they might be. They're always going to happen. It just to degrees. The recession in 2008 wasn't as bad as the Great Depression in the 30s. So after the Great Depression came the New Deal. We've talked about this before, maybe not in this context, but this is the FDR's New Deal marks big government and its huge entrance into the economy. Up until this point, government's attitude towards national economy was very laissez-faire. And laissez-faire means hands off, means that there is no sort of government interference or government regulation, and this was a key component of capitalism. It's taking your own course and your own failures. It means the market's going to work itself out. So when there is something that crashes or if a business fails, that's just part of the market economy. That's what it is. It's going to fail. If it doesn't live up or people don't want it, then it's going to work itself out. And the New Deal is seen as this huge interventionist policy. It's FDR's first act regarding banks took place on day one of his presidency. He started to regulate banks and put regulation in. And this was something that he promised. He said, the moment I get into office, I am starting to regulate these banks. One of the biggest changes he made was only solvent banks were allowed to operate. That means they were allowed to hold money. If they had money and held on to money, they were allowed to own and operate a business. But if they could not do that, they were gone. They were cut off, and people would be able to get their money back. And the New Deal reforms did such things as fiscal controls. It had huge financial controls over the market and the economy, over banks, over businesses. Agriculture got a huge amount of subsidies. There was a large amount of farms that failed because of the Great Depression. People couldn't buy food anymore. Farmers couldn't feed their crops. And it just was this huge cycle where it affected every aspect of economic depression. Agriculture was one of those key things that they needed to make sure that they subsidized. And a subsidy is when you give money from the government to a certain business or entity. And that's to try to help promote it, especially something as important as agriculture. We need to make food. It is an essential part of us being human that we eat. If we don't have agriculture, we're not going to survive. So our government needs to subsidize some of those farmers because it costs a lot to run a farm. If people can't afford those food products, like if we couldn't afford bread, or if our farmers weren't subsidized, bread, for example, will cost maybe $10 for a loaf, maybe even more, maybe double the price. And people can't buy that usually. That's not going to be good for our economy. So our government needs to subsidize the living wages for farmers in order to make sure that they can survive for their own families. It also brought up a large amount of labor rights, workers' rights, limiting the amount of hours people worked, the weekends that they worked, making sure that there were federal laws that prevented businesses from taking advantage of workers, abusing them basically, and abusing their time and their labor, not paying them enough, making the federal minimum wage. This was all important because if there wasn't a minimum wage, maybe businesses could pay you whatever they felt like. If they felt like you earned $2 an hour, then that was it. That's $2 an hour. That's all you're going to get. Some people might work for that, but there were others who might not be able to live off it. It also provided industrial regulation, banning unfair practices of businesses and making things safer for people. There were consumer protections that were put in, making sure if people bought something that it was like if they bought a loaf of bread, for example, it wasn't laced with like chemicals or poison or things like that people don't think about when they buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store. Because if something's being sold at the grocery store, it's probably FDA approved, which means the government has regulated it, has looked through it, and made sure that there is not something that's going to get you sick or is harmful to you. The Banking Act of 1935 was also a huge part of this. There was a Federal Reserve that was set up and a board of governors that were part of private industry, but also something that the government regulated that could make decisions that would maybe affect the economy and hopefully steer it in a good direction. There was the Adjustments Act of 1933, which basically limited a certain amount of crops so there wasn't overproduction and it would increase the price of certain products, so that way things weren't just completely low in terms of like there was an overproduction of one product basically. There was a National Labor Act in 1935, which basically set up all collective bargaining agreements, which basically paved the way for unions, for private enterprise to have unions, and for people to be able to have workers' rights and to be able to fight for their own, for fair labor practices. And then the FDA, it basically makes everything safe that we eat. It's a really fabulous government entity that makes sure that when you eat something, it is going to be safe for you and your family. And if there's something that isn't safe, it's going to be taken off the market. From this point, from the time of the end of the 1930s, and once we got out of the Great Depression, we've kind of basically had the same economic practice. Once FDR put a lot of these huge government regulations in, and so now in our modern economic policy, the first thing that we really need to talk about is deregulation. How much is too much regulation? How much should government interfere with the practices of private enterprise? The perception of regulation at first was that it wasn't good for the economy, that it put too many hamperings on private business that they wouldn't be able to grow, that there were too many things that they put on in rules and regulations that would make things more expensive and therefore would hurt the consumers, and therefore they wouldn't want to buy those products anymore. And the idea was there's a need for laissez-faire, which was deregulating the economy and fostering better competition between businesses. So that would mean, like, if you had two airline industries, for example, because we're going to talk about the airline industry next, if you had two airline industries and one had really good customer service and one had terrible customer service, the idea would be that the market would sort itself out, where the business with bad customer service would fail, and the one with great customer service would succeed. And that was because people wanted to go back and keep participating in that business and enterprise. This would make for a stronger economy, which would foster better competition between different entities and would make sure that businesses would only have good practices, largely since the end of the New Deal era and all the way up until the 80s. This was the biggest argument of the 80s were Reagan, the years of Reagan, the ideas of trickle-down economics. And it was adjusting the size and scope of government. This is where the 1980s were a huge time for Republicans, because there were a lot of Republican presidents before just Ronald Reagan, but he was one of the first ones to really establish this idea of deregulation equals better economic output. One of the most heavily regulated industries into the 70s was the airline industry. You'd be shocked at what it looked like. It was so different from what it is today, where we just have these massive corporations that run really, really big airlines, and they run all over the world. There used to be so many different little airlines that would fly to airports and things like that, but the problem was that it was pretty expensive for the most part. At that point, it was pretty expensive to fly. Things were regulated differently, where there would be a lot of room for people. There would be spacious areas. You could smoke. You could do different things that maybe weren't as great. The airline industry just looked very different. And then what happened was the deregulation happened, and small airlines couldn't keep up. They lost routes. There were hubs that were lost. There was poor maintenance, and it led to many, many airlines going bankrupt. Pan Am is for a good example of this. Was a huge airline for a long time. It was a little bit smaller than what we would consider. It was big for at that time, but now it would be considered pretty tiny. Didn't survive. That lost a ton of jobs for people. Another one was savings and loans, and then it was deregulated in the 80s, in 1988, and there was almost little to no control over loans and investments anymore in stock exchanges. And what we had was massive public bailouts. We just lost so much money from all the way to 2008, the dot-com bubble. There's been no regulation over loans and investments, and people took advantage of it, and it ended up crashing our economy in 2008, especially. That's at the beginning of the video. I just showed you guys a clip from the movie The Big Short. The Big Short is a great example of what happens when no one is paying attention or doesn't want to pay attention. And when that happens, when government doesn't pay attention, people can get hurt and people can lose a lot of money. The last big thing that we do in our modern economy is stabilize it. So as a definition, what stability means, or economic stability means, is a situation where there's economic growth, rising national income, high employment, and general steadiness in prices. If you have those four things, you have pretty firm economic stability. And stability can be affected by a couple different things. One is inflation, and that is a rise in price levels without corresponding increase in wages. Loss of purchasing power, basically. So a cost of soda, for example, let's use that as an example. I think like one of the big bottles of like Coke is like $1.49. But let's say that the products in Coke, they start going up in price, and Coke has to double or triple or quadruple its asking price, because there's just what happens is that people don't make enough money. They're going to stop buying Coke. That's just what's going to happen. But that's not just for one thing. Imagine if it was for every price that you had, like for beef, for example. If you inflate that price and you're not making more money, you're probably not going to buy beef anymore. Economic stability can also be affected by recession, which is a short-term decline usually. And this means investment sag, decreased production, and high unemployment. That's what we experienced in 2008. For the short term, it was 5 years, which is still pretty significant, but that's short term. That is a short time where things are a little bit lower and they dip lower than the usual amount of unemployment or increase in production. And usually there is some sort of high unemployment. I think the highest at the time of the recession was like 15%. Might have been higher than that at some points, but it was around there. It was anywhere from 10 to 15%. That is really, really high. You want to usually try to keep it below 5%. If you keep it below 5%, that's usually you are in a pretty good state. If you have it anywhere between 5 and 10%, you're doing all right. You're probably not growing as much as you should, but that's not as bad as anywhere from 10 and above, basically. And then there's depression, which is the last and probably the most devastating one, which is stagnation, massive unemployment, weakened purchasing powers, decline in GNP, which is gross national product, and business retrenchment, meaning that business can't grow. There's massive unemployment. People can't purchase as much as they could. There's massive inflation, and there's so much stagnation. There's no industry can grow, and it really just is a depression, like what it really says. The whole system usually fails. That's only happened once to us, thank goodness, but now hopefully we have things in there and tools that we use now and regulations that we use that would prevent us from going into depression. But that's not like it couldn't happen. This is part of living in an economic and market system. It could be a time where there's a massive depression. So the next one we're going to talk about is government tools. There's a couple of different ways that government uses tools to control certain aspects of the economy. So the first one is fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is using certain ideas and ways that the government can kind of steer the economy. So first one is taxation. How much money is coming in? So how much money are you taxing people? And where will it be spent? Those are the two things that you're asking for. And sometimes you want to spend more than you have coming in. Well, that leaves you with a deficit and deficit spending. And we are constantly in a deficit right now. We do not tax people enough and we spend too much. That is what we have right now. So we have a huge debt to pay. Our national debt is right now above a couple trillion. But people say that deficit spending might not be the worst thing, and it's the idea that government should make up the difference through spending in excess of revenue. So this was a theory presented by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, and I'll just read you off basically what he says. It's a standard fiscal theory that holds some level of total or aggregate spending, the sum of the consumer spending, private investment, and government spending. The economy will operate at full employment. If consumers and businesses spending does not create demand sufficient to cause government to operate at full employment, the government should make up the shortfall by increasing spending in excess of revenues. So meaning that if there's not enough money coming in, that what the government should do is fill that role to fill in the blanks, basically. If we do not have enough money to keep things functioning that our government does, the government's role is to make up that deficit. Ideally, you want a government to reduce its expenditures in size and run a surplus. Let's say our budget is $4 trillion right now. But let's say we make $5 trillion in taxes. Well, we have $1 trillion left over. What are we going to do with that? Maybe spend it on something. Maybe go spend it on our debt. Maybe go spend it on something else. What do we want to do with that? That's the question. That's only happened a couple different times. As of this recording, our national debt is $23 trillion, which is a lot of money. Our government really doesn't help this. We spend a lot of money and we keep giving tax breaks to people, and we spend more money and spend it on government programs. People have to be willing to pay taxes. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't. The deficit is the difference between what the U.S. government takes in from taxes and other revenues called receipts and the amount of money it spends called outlays. The items included in the deficit are considered either on budget or off budget. So you could have different items that are on the budget and on the national budget, and there's other things that come up that are not on the budget. The way you can think of the total debt is an accumulation of deficits paid plus the off-budget surpluses. So the on-budget deficit required by the U.S. Treasury to borrow money to raise cash needed to keep the government operating. It borrows the money by selling securities to the public. This means that the U.S. Treasury has all these different securities that you can buy up. You can buy U.S. national debt. And when you buy that debt, it's a way that they can make up their operating costs, basically. It has cash in hand after people buy their debt. And basically, it's like you're taking a risk on it almost. you're taking a risk that like they're not going to pay that debt back, and maybe you can make some money off of that. And I brought up this term before, but fiscal policy is really important to understanding government's role with economics. So there's a budgetary process attempts to predict both the economic cycle and the government's response. So the budget process also allows government to signal its priorities and plans to the public. This is a big part of what the president does. They say what their budget is for the year, the things they want to focus on. If you have Republican presidents, more than likely you're going to have less government spending, or for them to try to get less government spending or their departments to spend less. If you have Democrats, you might have more government programs that they want to expand and want to work on and want to work around. If they want to give more money to certain government entities, it's going to help them spend that money elsewhere. But the problem is that a lot of people don't want to raise taxes. So this is a huge issue, that spend more money. You want to spend money on government programs. That's great. But what is the offset for how you're going to pay for that? But in 1998, there was finally a budget surplus. So we still had debt, but our budget surplus, where we took more money in on taxes than what the government spent. It was the first time ever in our country's history. The goal of balancing a budget has always been bipartisan. This is not just a Republican or Democrat thing. This has always been a bipartisan issue up until the last couple of years. It's both been a Republican and Democrat issue now, that how much money we spend. But the disagreements have always been to, where do we want to put money? Republicans mostly want to spend money in like military and different aspects of our economy, helping private businesses or private entities. Democrats always want to spend it on public stuff, so public education. They want to spend it on healthcare and different things like that, where Republicans don't feel that's necessary because we have private entities to take care of that stuff. It's this idea, at least in our basic concept of government, is that there's a lot of tax and spend liberals versus fiscally conservative Republicans. The funny thing is, Republicans and Democrats spend the same amount on government. There's no difference between the two. Especially now in our current administration, we have a president who really does not care about that, who is not a fiscal conservative by any stretch of the imagination. So it's funny that they talk about fiscal conservatives when they have a president and party leadership who don't care about fiscal conservative. But then there are also Democrats who really want to spend a lot of money on certain things, but they don't want to talk about raising taxes because that can hurt their political chances. This is a weird policy that everybody has, that they kind of dance around this stuff, but really they don't even follow along with their ideas of fiscal conservative or the tax and spend liberals. There's two different policies that government can have. There's monetary policy and fiscal policy. And the first one, monetary policy, refers to actions that central banks take to pursue objectives such as price stability and maximum employment. And fiscal policy refers to government's revenue collection and spending decisions. So that's the key difference between these two, monetary and fiscal policy. It's really key that you guys know the difference between that. The government controls money supply and interest rates. So when you have an interest rate and how much you're going to loan out and what that interest is going to be on that, the government is the one that controls those interest rates. And that is from the Fed. The Fed is one of the key aspects of our fiscal policy, is the Federal Reserve System, which was created in 1913. It was there to adjust the money supply and the needs of the nation's industry and commerce and agriculture. The bad idea is you don't want to print just a bunch of money for people. I know people say that all the time. Why don't we just print out money? That's not how it works. You want to make sure that if you have something, if you have the dollar, you want to control and stabilize that price. That means that you don't want to inflate the price so much. You want to make money rare. If you make it rare in terms of it's hard to get money. I think everybody could agree. We could probably use more money. Everybody could probably use that. But the thing is, it is rare and it is valuable. And you want to keep that value that you have to it. So if you just keep printing it over and over, it becomes worthless after a while. If you just see everyone has a dollar, then that, what's the point? Currency is really important. You want to make sure that your currency doesn't inflate past a certain point. You don't want to just continuously print money, because if you do that, you're going to hurt the value of that money. So the Fed is one of the key aspects of this. They control the inflation costs. They try to control how much things cost in our economy so they can try to lower interest rates or raise interest rates. They want to make sure that they control and regulate this, because if they don't, that can really hurt the price stability of people. And it's a way for them to combat recessions too. The Fed was a key player in making sure that we got out of our recession in 2008. So the Fed is made up of 12 Federal Reserve banks. and there's a board of governors, and they're part of the Federal Open Market Committee, and there's a board of 7 members who serve 14-year terms. And we've had a couple different Federal Reserve people. As of this recording right now, it's Jerome Powell. That might change over the course of time because Trump really does not like him. He was a replacement for Janet Yellen, and right now he is currently in charge of the Federal Reserve, and he is the one who's really the face of the Fed and the one that they come to say, what are the interest rates going to be for this next quarter? And the Federal Reserve System is the bank's bank. So when you have a bank like Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank, all these different banks, they go to the Federal Reserve System, and that is the bank's bank. This is where all the money for the banking systems go to. The Federal Reserve is a huge, and they have no public interaction. This is only for the banks themselves. And so that way there's kind of a disconnect between the public and the private enterprise. So the Fed has a couple of different tools that they have. One is reserve requirements, meaning that they have bank controls now where the bank has to have a certain amount of money where if something were to happen, it can always fall back on that money in the bank. Because banks used to just be able to use that money and then go loan it out other places, and they wouldn't keep money in the bank. That's really not what you're supposed to do now. You're supposed to have a Federal Reserve in your bank. And there are requirements that are federally mandated. The second one is interest rates. How much when you loan out money, how much is that loan going to cost? How much money are you going when you take something out from the bank? How much money are when you buy a car, when you buy a house, when you get a loan for college? All those things are affected by the interest rate. And the second one is open market operations. How is the open market going to be affected by certain policy decisions that the Federal Reserve is going to make? It's part of their job to make sure that the market is free and open for everybody to participate in. So the last one I'm going to talk about is the United States and international political economy. We have a large control over our international economic system. And part of that is because we have always pushed for free market principles. We have always been a free market principled nation. We believe in the idea that you are open to sell, buy, and trade with anyone. That's kind of a policy that we've always participated in. We are kind of changing that policy, and that's partly because of just the system that we have now and the current administration that we have. You basically have two things. You have two choices. Subsidies, where you can participate and try to promote growth through government regulation, or protectionism, meaning that you protect your country and your economy, and you can also tariff people. I'm sure people have heard the word tariff now, which is a big part of the trade war with China that we are currently in the middle of. And this is part of the problem, that we have a system that is really open market, but tariffs are not part of an open market. We want to try to bring down as many tariffs as possible. But the United States, I think there's 3 things that you can really look at when it comes to United States economic policy. One, we want open and fair trade between all countries. The second is we believe in the idea of investing and grouping, usually for trade deals. That has been the most part what our modus operandi has been. We believe in the idea that the more big systems that you have and the more countries that you have trading, the better off you're going to be. And the second one is that you need to be fair and open in this economic system. And the thing is that we've used that against people. We prevent countries from coming into the system who we don't agree with. If we control the system, we can also affect our foreign policy. And I'll talk about that in our foreign policy section next week. But this is really important. So those are our usual policies that we have. We want people to openly participate. We don't want to regulate people, and we want to trade with people as much as possible. Trading means you are unlikely going to fight a country you are trading with because you are trading with them. You rely on them for certain things, and they rely on you for stuff. It means that you share things in your economy and your culture that are going to influence one another. So that's why this is really important that people understand that this is a policy tool that we use as the United States. But now that's changing. We have a president who really doesn't believe in a fair and open system. And for rightfully so, for some things, he believes that certain countries are cheating us in some ways. I don't really think he understands all of economic policy, funny enough, but he definitely does understand the fact that there are different countries that have been taking advantage of the United States, and the United States has let them take advantage. China, for example, has taken advantage of free market principles. They've taken intellectual property rights from different businesses and then made cheaper versions of that. So that's been a big issue. But the way that he goes about it is that he then taxes that country, and it hurts businesses, especially the soybean business. Agriculture is really hurt right now. There are different things that are happening that don't really match up with the ideas of free markets. So we have 2 choices. You can either believe in free market principles or protectionist principles, meaning that you either believe in the free market and how much you want to expand the free market from other countries and other civilizations, or you believe in protecting your own individual country. And so there's some argument to both sides, I think. I think the best way that our country has always approached this is a balanced approach where we don't believe so much in a free market where we want people to take advantage of, but we don't want to control every aspect of our economy. And if you have a good balancing act between the two, it can really flourish. But if you try to go one way or another, it can really hurt either side. I hope this wasn't too fast. I feel like I kind of rushed it, but honestly, it's pretty straightforward. The economic stuff is really simple when it comes to understanding our economic principles and where they come from. I don't feel like there's much detail to go into because honestly, like, a lot of it is straightforward. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions about this is a really important stuff, especially as we get into the next presidential election cycle. I'm sure economic policy will be talked about. It's almost a guarantee. So if you guys have any questions about this, let me know. I'm expecting next week for us to go into foreign policy, and then we're done with media, and then it's the final test, and that's it. I mean, it's just crazy. So if you guys have any questions about this, let me know. We're getting into a time where it's really important that you guys know this stuff, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys later.